everyone, Kelly here, and I want to talk about another reading challenge that I want to do for 2023. Recently, I put up a video about the 23 books I want to read in 2023, which were 23 standalone books, because I'd already done like a list of series I want to read this year. And why not add another challenge and another yearly TBR? But this one was because I saw this kind of like bingo board type thing, prompt board on Instagram, and I thought it was a really interesting reading challenge and one that I really want to do because it focuses on reading diversely. And so what this is called is diversity across genres. I'll put the board up here, and this was created on Instagram by Books on Adventures and Reading and Roaming. So I'll make sure to link their Instagram accounts down below as well in case you want to find the board yourself. And basically they created this reading challenge to show that you can read diversely of like the authors that you read, but also you can find diverse books in every single genre. So the way they did the board was on the top, it has like different author demographics. And then on the like side of the board, it'll have like the different genres. So for example, the first column is Black authors. And so finding a, general fiction book, a romance, a thriller horror, a sci-fi fantasy, and a nonfiction, all written by a Black author. And I just thought this was a great idea of like thinking about finding diverse authors in every single genre. And I read a lot of different genres, so this is really helpful for me. And the way I approached filling this with a TBR was I first looked at the list I already have. So the 23 books to read in 2023, the series I want to read. And if I already had some that fill this category, I filled those in. So some of these were already ones that I was planning on reading this year. And then I looked at my physical TBR, and I really wanted to use the books that I already own, because that was one of my goals this year, was to, read off of my physical TBR. And I did really good. I ended up, there are 30 spaces on this board because it's like a 5x5 for the authors and genres. And then there's like a bonus rep down below, which I'll talk about. So that's a total of 30 books on this TBR. And 21 of these I had owned prior to 2023. And so I thought that was really good. That showed that I already am doing a pretty good job of buying books from diverse demographics. So that was encouraging. And then I ended up buying 6 more books for this challenge at the beginning, like in January. And they were already books that were on my Goodreads TBR, like my wish list. And so I was like, well, this is a good excuse that I was in the mood to buy books. And I'm like, why not support these authors? So I did buy 6 more books for this. And then I have 3 that I don't own. And that's because there was like you'll see there's a 2023 release on here that I'm interested in. There's one that I'm just unsure that that's the book I want to read. I want to kind of like get recommendations or see. I'd heard of a book. You'll see. I'll talk about later. And then there's one that I need to replace because I've already DNF'd the book that I had put in that spot. All right, let's just get to the TBR now. I'm going to do this by column on that board. So the first column was books written by Black authors. And for general fiction, I included historical fiction in this because, sometimes I don't read a lot of contemporaries. So I was like, as long as it's contemporary or historical, I'm including that in this. And for that, I chose Finding Langston by Lisa Klein Ransom, which takes place during the Great Migration. And this was one that was already on my series TBR. And then for romance, I have 7 Days in June by Tia Williams. And this is one that had been on my Goodreads, want to read list. And I just went ahead and bought a copy. And I've heard really good things about this one. And then for the thriller horror section, I picked The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson. And this is one that I've wanted to read. I bought it back in like September, October when I was talking about reading witch books in the fall. And I had started this one, but then, it turned into December and I was like, I'm done reading witch books. So I already have had this on my list of books to read in 2023. So I picked that one. And then for sci-fi fantasy, I had several. The problem is that I own more diverse books, but so many of them are fantasy. And so like the fantasy section was very easy for me to fill out, but then I was like, I have like more fantasy books. So I decided the one I picked for this was Akata Witch by Nnedi Okorafor, because I've been meaning to read this for years and I finally need to read it. This was also on my series TBR for this year. And then for the nonfiction, I also had a lot of nonfiction picks, but I chose The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity and Racism by Jamar Tisby. And I have already started this one just like 30 pages in, but that one I have already started and enjoying. And then the next column is Asian or Pacific Islander. And so the first one I have for general fiction is A Time to Dance by Padma Venkatraman, and this is about a girl who likes to dance, and then I think she gets in an accident where she has to have a leg amputated, and kind of her relearning her love of dance after that injury. And then for romance, this one, I don't know that this is completely categorized as a romance, but there is a romance in it, and I've owned it for several years, and this is the push I need to read it. I might go ahead and read another like romance written by an Asian author that is more like a genre romance, but I just really need to read this book. So that's why I picked it for this category, but I might still read some more. And this is Written in the Stars by Aisha Saeed, and I just really need to read this since I've owned it for many years. And then yeah, like I said, I might fill in something else in addition as well. And then for the thriller horror, I have Out by Natsuo Kirino, and this is translated from Japanese, and I've heard really good things about this thriller, and I think it actually follows the murderer in this, and so yeah, I've heard really good things and want to read that. And then for sci-fi fantasy, once again, I had lots of options for this, but I chose Exhalation by Ted Chiang, because this is already on my like 23 books to read in 2023 list, and so want to definitely read this. This is a short story collection that I think is mainly sci-fi, but might also have fantasy stories as well. And I've just heard really great things about his stories. And then for nonfiction, I picked The Girl with Seven Names, Escape from North Korea by Hyunseo Lee. And this is just her story of her leaving North Korea. And I have already read like one book about somebody who has escaped North Korea, and they're very intense, so I might have to wait a little bit later in the year to read this one to give some space between the two books, but I definitely want to read this one. And then the next column is Middle Eastern, North African, or Arab, and for general fiction I have A Thousand Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini, and this is one I've had for a long time. I've heard of this author for a long time. Very popular author from writing about people in Afghanistan. And so I finally should read one, because I think I've owned several of his books at some point and kind of gone back and forth because I know that they're tough to read. So I have this one on there. I'm hoping to get to this, but if this feels like it might be too intense for me, another book that I want to read that's on like my wish list is As the Lemon Trees Grow. Is that, I did not look up the title before I decided to say that, but I might substitute this book if later in this year I decide to buy it, and I am not ready to read this one yet. So one of those two books will fall into this category. And then for romance, I have Love from A to Z by S.K. Ali, and this is another one I just bought in January, but this has been on my wish list for a couple years now. I've heard really great things about it. I think it partly takes place in Qatar. Like, I think that they go on a trip to Qatar. So I've heard great things and want to read that. So I just was like, I'm going to buy it and get it. And then for the thriller horror, this is the one that I had a hard time filling in. I just couldn't find one I was interested in. So I picked one that I heard recently talked about on a podcast, and it sounded interesting, but I'm worried that it might be too gory. So I'm going to give it a try. I'm not going to buy it. I'm going to like try a couple chapters and see. But if you have any like recommendations for a thriller and horror from a like Middle Eastern author or North African author, then let me know. But the one that I am tentatively going to read is Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmed Sadawi. And since this is like a Frankenstein retelling and it involves like war and like putting together parts of bodies of people that have died in war, it might be too intense, like too graphic for me. So like I said, I'm going to try it, but if you know of another like recommendation, let me know. And then for sci-fi fantasy, I have Thorn by Intisar Kanani, and this is a Goose Girl retelling, and I've been wanting to read this for a while now, so I definitely am excited to read that. That was on my series TBR for the year. And then for nonfiction, I have The Lightless Sky, a 12-year-old refugee's extraordinary journey across half the world by Gulwali Pasarlay. And this one is his story of leaving Afghanistan. And so I've owned this for a few years as well, so I'd like to get to it. And then the next column is Indigenous authors. And for general fiction, I have another one that's historical, and that is The Birch Bark House by Louise Erdrich. And, you know, this author is just super popular. I've never read anything by her. I've put this book on my TBR several times in the last year. The problem is I keep putting it on my TBR to read with my daughter, and then she has showed no interest in reading it. I'm assuming it's because the cover is just bland. And so like when we're about to read a new book, I usually show her like a couple books, and she never picks this one. And so I'm just going to read it myself. And if it turns out to be something that I think she'll like, I might just be like, we're going to read this and have her like try it out instead of like choosing it by the cover. But even if I don't read it with her, I am going to read it this year. And yeah, because I really do want to read something by Louise Erdrich. And then for romance, this is the one where I had something in this slot and then I DNF'd it already. Like I started it like the second week of January, didn't enjoy it. And so I haven't refilled a new romance by Indigenous author yet. I have a couple like on my radar that I'm going to get from the library, try a couple chapters and like decide, and then I could either buy it or, you know, continue to read it from the library. So I have some options for this. I can't remember the names of them right now, so I'm not going to mention them now. But if you have any recommendations of romances by Indigenous authors, let me know, because maybe I'll try a few different ones to figure out what to slot into this area. And then for thriller horror, I have a book that was also on my 23 books to read in 2023, and that's Moon of the Crusted Snow by Wabisha Rice. And this is like a dystopian type of sci-fi book during the middle of an apocalypse. And yeah, so that one I want to read this year. And then for sci-fi fantasy, I have Sisters of the Neversea by Cynthia Leidig Smith. And one of the romance books that I was going to read is also by this author, but then I'm like, oh, is it kind of cheating to read two books by the same author in a category? Because there are so many Indigenous authors out there. Should I really be reading two by the same author? But I kind of want to read her romance book, so we'll see. But let me know if there's other romance recommendations. But this one is a Peter Pan retelling, and so I'm excited to read that one. And that one also is on my 23 books to read in 2023. And then for nonfiction, I have Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer. This one also was on my 23 books to read in 2023. And then the last column is Latinx, and for general fiction, I have I Am Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter by Erica L. Sanchez. And I don't know much about this one. I know it's a contemporary, but I've heard really good reviews, so that's why I had picked it up to read. And then for romance, I had just bought Our Way Back to Always by Nina Moreno, and I had bought this because I've read one of her other romance, like young adult romances, and I really enjoyed the family dynamics. I didn't like love the romance, but I liked the like family aspect. So I'm hoping in this one I will like the romance more. But even if I don't love the romance, I know that there'll be good like characters in general, even if I'm not the like biggest fan of the romance. Yeah, but that is the one I picked for romance. And then for thriller horror, this is the one that is a new release. So this comes out in April 2023, and it just sounds really interesting. And so I wanted to put it on this list so I remembered to read it. And that's The Haunting of Alejandra by V. Castro. And I think this involves like a Mexican folklore demon that is haunting this girl. And the cover is stunning. And I love folklore stories. So I'm very excited to read that one. So I put it into the slot. Then for sci-fi fantasy, I have Love, Sugar, Magic, A Dash of Trouble by Anna Mariano. And this is one I also had already planned to read this year for my series I'm reading in 2023. And this is about a girl who finds out her family are brujas and like they have Baking Magic, which sounds lovely. And then for the nonfiction, I have In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. And this is one I just bought a couple weeks ago for this challenge because I've had a lot of, like, I have several of her books on my, like, wish list and just hadn't bought any yet. And I've been interested to read her stuff. So I was like, I'm going to go ahead and buy it because I do want to read it. This is her memoir of kind of like going through a abusive relationship, and I've heard really great things about her writing, so I wanted to pick up one of her books. Then on the bottom row, there's bonus rep, so I'll go through each one of these in the book I picked. So for disability rep, I picked Disability Visibility, First Person Stories from the 21st Century, edited by Alice Wong, and this is one that I had also put on my 23 books to read in 2023. And then for queer representation, I picked Pet by Akwaeke Emezi, and I've just heard fantastic things about this book and really want to make sure I read it this year. And then for translated, I had a few options, but one that's been sitting on my TBR for a long time, it just kind of like never gets picked up because it's huge, is Battle Royale by Koshun Takami. And this is kind of like Hunger Games, but Japanese version, and I've heard great things about it, but it is very big, so I just have avoided reading it even though I've owned it for several years and want to read it. So that's why I picked it as my translated work. And then for immigrant representation, I bought The Best We Could Do by Tai Bui. I'll have to look up how to say their name. I don't know if I said that right. But yeah, this is a graphic memoir. And I love graphic memoirs, and I've had this one on my wish list for a long time, but you know, graphic memoirs or graphic novels are just more expensive, but I was like, I should be supporting this author even though it is a little expensive. So I bought it for this challenge since I definitely wanted to get to it. So I want to read that one. And then for mental health representation, I purchased Me Moth by Amber McBride. And this is another one I just bought, but it had been on my list. It was like a winner in poetry. Is that right? Yeah, so it's poetry. And it was, I think it won the Goodreads poetry section a couple years ago. Was it just last year? And I remember seeing this cover when I was looking at like the Goodreads awards last year and thinking, that looks amazing. I don't usually read poetry, but beautiful cover. So I'm like, you know, I'm gonna give it a try. I'm not like the biggest into poetry, but that's because I just haven't given it a fair chance. So this is supposed to have good mental health representation. So like, gonna give poetry some more chances this year. And that's it. Those are the 30 books that I would like to read this year that kind of focused on reading more diversely. And I also, in addition, this kind of made me start to think about, since I bought a few books for this challenge, about buying books this year, and that I really don't want to just be buying a ton of books this year, because like in the past I've kind of just spent most of my fun money that's budgeted on books, and I don't want to do that this year. I want to spend money on some other hobbies, but I still want to occasionally buy books. So I think that my goal this year is to focus on only buying books by diverse authors, so marginalized authors, and that way I'm not giving myself a book buying ban, but that I am being a little more focused on how I buy my books this year. So this challenge kind of like made me think of that, and so I think this will be really good for me to read more diversely and read more books on my physical TBR that I'm interested in and want to read. So that's it for me. If you are participating in the challenge, let me know, or if you have any recommendations, even if I already filled in a slot and you want to give me more recommendations, that's great, because if it's not sci-fi fantasy, then I probably didn't have a lot of options, because that's my go-to is sci-fi fantasy. So I will always take more like romance recommendations, thriller, horror, general fiction. Yeah, so sci-fi fantasy and nonfiction are the ones that I tend to buy a lot of. So let me know if you have recommendations for those other genres by diverse authors. Hey, I already put away my tripod, but I just thought about this, that if you want to buddy read any of these books with me, that is great for accountability and making sure that I'm reading them, and also just fun to discuss books with other people. So if you have any of these books already on your TBR and you would like to buddy read with them with me, then let me know down below, or you can always message me on Instagram. I'm Cozy Reader Kelly on Instagram as well. So let me know if you want to buddy read any of these books. You know, I'm always up for that. And especially this year, I want to buddy read more things. And I will let you know how this goes. I'll give you some updates on my challenges throughout the year, and I will see you next time. Bye.